Picture this. You serve your country for 8 years, deploy twice to Afghanistan, come home with injuries that will follow you for life, only to discover that your own brother has been stealing your military benefits while you were overseas. And when you finally report it, the Inspector General's office tells you something that shatters everything you believed about honor and service. You're not a hero. This is the story of Gianna Robinson's and how she learned that sometimes the enemy isn't on the battlefield, it's sitting at your family dinner table. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Gianna Robinson's enlisted in the Army straight out of high school in Bakersfield, California. At 18, she was idealistic, patriotic, and absolutely convinced that serving her country was the most honorable thing a person could do. Her older brother Marcus had always been the golden child, charming, successful in business, and somehow always managing to land on his feet no matter what trouble he got into. When Gianna left for basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Marcus threw her a going-away party. He gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes, talking about how proud he was of his little sister for choosing to serve. He promised to take care of anything she needed while she was gone, to be her point person for family matters, and to make sure all her affairs were in order. What Gianna didn't know was that Marcus had been struggling financially for months. His consulting business was hemorrhaging money, he was behind on his mortgage, and his wife Sarah was threatening to leave him if he didn't get their finances under control. When Marcus volunteered to help manage Gianna's affairs, it wasn't out of brotherly love, it was opportunity knocking. Gianna's first deployment came after 2 years of service. She was stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan, working as a communications specialist. The work was dangerous, the conditions were harsh, and the isolation from family was brutal. But she threw herself into the job, earning commendations for her technical skills and her ability to keep communication lines open during some of the most intense firefights her unit experienced. Back home in California, Marcus had gradually gained access to more and more of Gianna's financial information. It started small. He convinced their parents that he needed to help pay some of Gianna's bills while she was deployed. She had asked him to handle her car payments and keep an eye on her apartment, so it seemed reasonable when he asked for access to her bank account information. The military benefits system, Marcus discovered, was surprisingly easy to navigate if you had the right information. Gianna had set up direct deposit for her combat pay, her family separation allowance, and various other benefits that deployed soldiers receive. She was making good money, and since she was living on base overseas, most of that money was just sitting in her accounts. Marcus started with small withdrawals, $50 here, $100 there. He told himself he was borrowing, that he'd pay it back when his business turned around. He kept meticulous records at first, writing down every transaction with a promise to himself that this was temporary. But Marcus's business didn't turn around. If anything, it got worse. His biggest client dropped him, citing poor performance and missed deadlines. His credit cards were maxed out, and he was facing foreclosure on his house. Sarah was working double shifts as a nurse just to keep them afloat, and the stress was destroying their marriage. That's when Marcus made the decision that would ultimately destroy his relationship with his sister forever. He applied for power of attorney over Gianna's finances, forging her signature on the documents. With his business background and natural charisma, he managed to convince a notary public that Gianna had signed the documents during a brief leave that she had never actually taken. Armed with legal power of attorney, Marcus began systematically draining Gianna's accounts. He redirected her combat pay to his own account, claiming he was managing her finances while she was deployed. He applied for additional benefits in her name, including hardship allowances that she wasn't entitled to, but that the system approved based on fraudulent applications. The most audacious theft came when Marcus discovered that Gianna was eligible for a substantial re-enlistment bonus. She had mentioned in a letter that she was considering extending her service, and Marcus saw dollar signs. He forged her signature on re-enlistment papers, collected the bonus payment, and then immediately submitted discharge papers, also forged, claiming that Gianna had changed her mind due to family emergency. Meanwhile, Gianna was dealing with her own crisis overseas. During a mortar attack on her base, she suffered a traumatic brain injury and damage to her hearing that would later be classified as a 30% disability. She spent weeks in a military hospital in Germany, confused and struggling with memory problems, before being medically evacuated back to the United States. The head injury affected her cognitive function in subtle but significant ways. She had trouble concentrating, experienced severe headaches, and found herself forgetting important details. When she finally made it back to California and tried to access her accounts, she initially attributed the confusion about her finances to her injury. Marcus was there every step of the way, playing the concerned brother perfectly. He helped her navigate the VA disability system, drove her to medical appointments, and even moved her into his guest room while she recovered. All the while, he was continuing to steal from her, now taking her disability payments as well as the remainder of her military benefits. It took Gianna almost 6 months to realize what was happening. Her cognitive function was slowly improving, and she was starting to ask more detailed questions about her finances. Marcus had explanations for everything: medical bills, apartment costs while she was deployed, emergency expenses that had come up, but the numbers weren't adding up. The breakthrough came when Gianna received a letter from the IRS asking about unreported income. According to their records, she had received over $40,000 in military benefits that she hadn't declared on her tax return. The problem was, she had never seen that money. When she confronted Marcus with the letter, his carefully constructed facade began to crack. He claimed there must be some mistake, that he'd help her sort it out, but Gianna could see the panic in his eyes. She had seen that same look on his face when they were kids, and he'd been caught in a lie. That night, Gianna drove to the base legal office and requested copies of all her military financial records. What she found was a systematic pattern of theft that went back almost 3 years. Her brother hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen her identity, forged her signature on official military documents, and committed fraud against the federal government. The total amount was staggering: over $85,000 in stolen benefits, forged bonuses, and fraudulent claims. Marcus had been living off her military service while she was overseas getting injured in service to her country. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization that while she was risking her life for her country, believing she was part of something noble and honorable, her own brother was treating her sacrifice as nothing more than a business opportunity. Every letter he had sent talking about how proud he was, every family gathering where he had bragged about his sister the soldier, it had all been a lie designed to cover up his theft. Gianna gathered all the evidence she could find and prepared to do what she had been trained to do in the military: report the crime through proper channels and trust the system to deliver justice. She had faith that the military justice system would take care of one of their own, that the Inspector General's office would investigate thoroughly and hold Marcus accountable for his crimes. She had no idea that her faith in the system was about to be shattered just as completely as her faith in her family had been. The Inspector General's office at Fort Carson was housed in a nondescript building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a center for military justice. Gianna sat in the waiting room, clutching a manila folder thick with bank statements, forged documents, and printed emails that documented 3 years of systematic theft. She had rehearsed her presentation dozens of times, organizing the evidence chronologically and preparing answers for every question she could anticipate. When Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Patterson finally called her into his office, Gianna felt a surge of confidence. Patterson was a career military man with 23 years of service, someone who understood the sacrifices soldiers made and the sacred trust that existed within the military community. Surely he would take her case seriously. Patterson's office was sterile and efficient, with commendation plaques covering one wall and a bookshelf filled with military regulations and legal manuals. He gestured for Gianna to sit across from his desk and opened a fresh legal pad, pen poised to take notes. "Sergeant Robbins," he began, "I've reviewed your initial complaint. You're alleging that your brother stole military benefits totaling approximately $85,000 over a 3-year period. That's a serious accusation." Gianna opened her folder and began laying out the evidence methodically. She showed him the forged power of attorney documents, the bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals, the fraudulent reenlistment paperwork that Marcus had submitted in her name. She explained how her brother had redirected her combat pay, applied for benefits she wasn't entitled to, and even collected a reenlistment bonus before immediately submitting discharge papers. Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. His expression remained neutral throughout her presentation, giving Gianna no indication of what he was thinking. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied the documents she had spread across his desk. "This is certainly a complex situation," he said finally, "but I have to ask you something, Sergeant. Why did you give your brother access to your financial information in the first place?" The question caught Gianna off guard. She had expected him to focus on the crime, not on her decision to trust her family. "Sir, he's my brother. I was deploying to Afghanistan, and I needed someone to handle my affairs back home. I trusted him." Patterson nodded slowly. "And you signed documents giving him power of attorney?" "No, sir. I never signed those documents. The signature is forged, as I explained. I can provide handwriting samples if needed." "But you did give him access to your bank accounts initially." "Yes, sir, but only for specific bills, car payments, and rent on my apartment. I never authorized him to access my military benefits or apply for additional payments." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Patterson made another note on his pad. "Sergeants, I want you to understand something. The Inspector General's office investigates allegations of misconduct, fraud, and violations of military regulations. What you're describing sounds more like a family dispute that got out of hand." Gianna felt her stomach drop. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a family dispute. This is fraud against the federal government. My brother forged official military documents and stole government benefits. The amount exceeds federal felony thresholds." "I understand your frustration," Patterson said, his tone becoming slightly patronizing. "But we have to look at the bigger picture here. You voluntarily gave your brother access to your finances. You were overseas and not monitoring your accounts. These things happen in military families all the time." "Sir, I was deployed in a combat zone. I was injured serving my country. I trusted my family to handle basic bill payments, not to steal my combat pay and disability benefits." Patterson closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. "Sergeant Robinsons, let me be frank with you. The military doesn't have unlimited resources to investigate every financial disagreement between family members. What I see here is a communication breakdown between you and your brother, possibly some poor decision-making on both sides, and a situation that spiraled out of control." Gianna couldn't believe what she was hearing. Poor decision-making on both sides? "Sir, I didn't make any poor decisions. I was doing my job as a soldier. My brother committed fraud." "Look," Patterson said, leaning forward with what was clearly meant to be a reassuring expression, "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've seen hundreds of cases involving military personnel and their families. Money causes problems, especially when someone's deployed for extended periods. But the reality is, this is a civil matter. You need to handle this through the civilian courts, not through military channels." Gianna felt a surge of anger building in her chest. "Sir, the fraud involves military benefits and forged military documents. How is this not a military matter?" Patterson's expression hardened slightly. "Sergeant, I'm going to share something with you that might be difficult to hear, but I think you need to understand the reality of your situation. You're not special because you served overseas. You're not automatically entitled to sympathy or special treatment because you wore a uniform." The words hit Gianna like a physical blow. "Sir, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for an investigation into documented fraud." "What I'm telling you," Patterson continued, "is that serving in the military doesn't make you a hero. It makes you someone who did a job that you volunteered for, that you were paid to do, and that came with certain risks that you accepted when you signed your enlistment contract." Gianna stared at him in disbelief. "I was injured in combat, sir. I have a 30% disability rating from my service." "And you're receiving compensation for that disability, aren't you? The system is working exactly as it's designed to work. You're not a victim here, Sergeant. You're someone who made some questionable decisions about trusting family members with access to your finances, and now you're dealing with the consequences." The patronizing tone in Patterson's voice was unmistakable now. Gianna realized that he had already made up his mind about her case before she had even walked into his office. The evidence didn't matter. The clear pattern of fraud didn't matter. What mattered was that she was being labeled as someone seeking undeserved sympathy. Sir, are you telling me that the Inspector General's office will not investigate this case? Patterson picked up his pen and made a final note on his legal pad. I'm telling you that based on my review of the materials you've provided, this appears to be a civil matter between family members. The IG's office investigates systemic problems, policy violations, and command failures. What you're describing is a personal financial dispute. According to you, it's fraud. But what I see is a family member who had authorized access to your accounts making financial decisions that you now regret. The burden of proof for criminal fraud is extremely high, and frankly, I don't see evidence that meets that threshold. Gianna began gathering her documents from Patterson's desk, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. So, that's it? You're not going to investigate? Patterson stood up, clearly indicating that the meeting was over. Sergeant, I'm going to give you some advice. Take this as a learning experience. Be more careful about who you trust with your financial information in the future. Handle this through civilian courts if you want to pursue it further. And maybe consider that constantly seeing yourself as a victim isn't going to serve you well in the long run. The words stung worse than any physical injury Gianna had sustained in Afghanistan. She had come to the Inspector General's office believing that the military would take care of its own, that her service and sacrifice meant something, that the system would deliver justice when one of its members was wronged. Instead, she was being dismissed as someone seeking undeserved sympathy, told that her military service was just a job, and advised that she was playing the victim. The very institution she had served and sacrificed for was turning its back on her when she needed it most. As she walked out of Patterson's office, Gianna realized that her faith in the military justice system had been shattered as completely as her faith in her family. The betrayal by her brother had been devastating, but this felt worse somehow. Marcus had acted out of desperation and selfishness, but Patterson represented the institution she had believed in, the system she had trusted to protect and serve its members. Now she understood that she was truly on her own. Gianna sat in her car outside the Inspector General's office for 45 minutes after her meeting with Patterson, too stunned to drive. The parking lot was filled with military vehicles and government-issued sedans, representing the very system that had just abandoned her. She watched soldiers and civilian employees walking in and out of the building, going about their daily business, completely unaware that inside those walls, justice had just been denied to one of their own. When she finally drove back to Marcus's house, she still had nowhere else to live, she found him in the kitchen making dinner, as if nothing had happened. Sarah was at the table helping their 8-year-old daughter Emma with homework, the picture of domestic normalcy. For a moment, Gianna felt like she was losing her mind. How could everything look so normal when her world had just collapsed? "Hey, how did it go with the military people?" Marcus asked, not looking up from the stove. The casual way he phrased the question made Gianna's blood boil. He knew exactly what that meeting was about, and he was pretending it was some routine administrative matter. "They're not investigating," Gianna said quietly. Marcus turned around, and for just a split second, she saw relief flash across his face before he arranged his features into an expression of concern. "Oh no, that's terrible. What did they say?" The performance was flawless. If Gianna hadn't known better, she would have believed that Marcus was genuinely disappointed on her behalf. But she could see through it now. The same manipulative charm he had used their entire lives, the same fake sincerity he had perfected in his business dealings. They said it was a civil matter, a family dispute. Sarah looked up from Emma's homework. Well, maybe that's for the best. I mean, getting the military involved in family business could get really messy. Gianna stared at her sister-in-law, wondering if Sarah knew about the theft or if she had been kept in the dark. Given their financial struggles, it seemed impossible that Sarah wouldn't have noticed the sudden influx of money, but Marcus was skilled at compartmentalizing information. That night, Gianna lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out her next move. She had savings from her deployment, what little Marcus hadn't stolen, but not enough to get her own place and hire a lawyer simultaneously. Her disability payments would start soon, but those would barely cover basic living expenses. The next morning, she drove to the nearest library and spent 6 hours researching federal fraud statutes and civilian legal procedures. What she learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Marcus had clearly committed multiple federal crimes: wire fraud, identity theft, forgery of federal documents, and theft of government benefits. The evidence was overwhelming and well documented. But pursuing the case would require resources she didn't have. A competent attorney specializing in federal crimes would cost at least $50,000 upfront. The FBI might investigate, but federal agencies were notoriously selective about which cases they pursued, and without military backing, her case would be competing with thousands of others for attention. Gianna realized she needed allies, people who understood the system and could help her navigate it. She started by contacting other veterans organizations, hoping to find someone who had dealt with similar issues. The first 3 organizations she called were sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. They dealt primarily with disability claims and benefits appeals, not criminal fraud cases. The fourth call, to a veterans' rights advocacy group in Denver, connected her with a paralegal named Janet Morrison who had seen cases like hers before. The dirty secret, Janet explained during their phone conversation, is that fraud against military personnel by family members is more common than anyone wants to admit. The military doesn't like to investigate these cases because they're messy and time-consuming, and they make the institution look bad. They'd rather pretend it's a personal problem. Janet's words confirmed what she had begun to suspect after her meeting with Patterson. The military's reluctance to investigate wasn't about resources or jurisdiction, it was about reputation management. "What are my options?" Gianna asked. "You can file complaints with the FBI, the Department of Veterans Affairs Fraud Hotline, and your state's Attorney General. You can also pursue civil litigation, but I have to be honest with you, it's going to be an uphill battle, and it's going to take years." Years. Federal investigations move slowly, and civil cases involving family members get complicated fast. Your brother will claim you authorized his actions, that he was helping manage your finances, that any mistakes were honest errors. He'll hire a good lawyer and drag this out as long as possible. Gianna felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her. She was a combat veteran with a traumatic brain injury, living in her thief brother's guest room, fighting both the federal government and her own family for justice. The odds seemed impossible. But then Janet said something that changed everything. "There is one thing that might help your case. If your brother filed fraudulent tax returns using the stolen money, the IRS takes that very seriously. Tax fraud investigations have their own timeline and their own prosecutors. They also have the authority to freeze assets and seize property pending investigation." For the first time since leaving Patterson's office, Gianna felt a spark of hope. She had kept copies of all the tax documents Marcus had prepared for her over the past 3 years, claiming he was helping her navigate the complexity of military tax filings. Looking at them now with fresh eyes, she could see discrepancies and omissions that hadn't made sense at the time. The next day, Gianna drove to the IRS office in Colorado Springs and filed a formal complaint alleging tax fraud. The process was surprisingly straightforward. She filled out forms, provided documentation, and submitted copies of all the evidence she had gathered. The clerk who processed her complaint was professional but non-committal about timelines or outcomes. But something had changed in Gianna's approach. She was no longer the idealistic soldier trusting the system to deliver justice. She was becoming a strategist, someone who understood that she would have to fight for every inch of progress, that no one was going to hand her a victory. She spent the following weeks systematically filing complaints with every relevant agency: the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the VA's Fraud Hotline, the Colorado Attorney General's Office, and the Federal Trade Commission. Each complaint was meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and followed up with additional evidence. Marcus began to notice the change in her behavior. She was no longer the confused, grateful sister accepting his help and explanations. She was asking pointed questions about financial records, requesting copies of documents he claimed to have filed on her behalf, and taking notes during their conversations. "You seem stressed lately," he said one evening as they passed in the hallway. "Maybe you should talk to someone. The VA has counseling services for veterans dealing with adjustment issues."
The suggestion was delivered with perfect brotherly concern, but Gianna could hear the subtext. Marcus was already building his defense, preparing to characterize her as an unstable veteran whose accusations couldn't be trusted. But she was beyond caring about his manipulations now. She had learned that the system wouldn't protect her, that her military service meant nothing to the people who were supposed to serve veterans, and that her own family saw her as nothing more than a source of income to be exploited. The knowledge was devastating, but it was also liberating. If she couldn't rely on anyone else, she would have to become her own advocate, her own investigator, and her own source of justice. The war for her stolen benefits was just beginning, and this time she knew exactly who the enemy was. 3 months after filing her IRS complaint, Gianna received a phone call that changed everything. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division wanted to meet in person to discuss her case. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a federal building in Denver, and Torres advised her to bring all original documentation. Gianna had been working part-time at a sporting goods store in Colorado Springs, trying to save enough money to move out of Marcus's house. Her disability payments had finally started coming through, but between her living expenses and the cost of copying documents and filing complaints, she was barely breaking even financially. The constant stress of living with Marcus while building a case against him was taking its toll on her mental health. Marcus had become increasingly suspicious of her activities. He asked probing questions about where she was going, what she was doing during the day, and why she was spending so much time on her laptop. Sarah had started making comments about Gianna needing to move forward and let go of the past. The house felt like a pressure cooker, with everyone pretending everything was normal while tensions simmered beneath the surface. The drive to Denver took 2 hours, giving Gianna time to prepare mentally for what might be her last real chance at justice. She had organized all her evidence into chronological binders, created timelines of Marcus's fraudulent activities, and prepared detailed written statements about each incident. Special Agent Torres was nothing like what Gianna had expected. She was young, probably early 30s, with an intensity that reminded Gianna of some of the best officers she had served under in Afghanistan. Torres's office was spartanly furnished, but filled with case files and financial documents covering every available surface. "Mrs. Robinson's," Torres began, "I've reviewed your complaint and the supporting documentation. What your brother did represents one of the most systematic cases of benefits fraud I've seen in my 12 years with criminal investigation." For the first time in months, Gianna felt validation. Someone in law enforcement was taking her case seriously, treating her as a credible witness rather than a complaining family member. Torres spread several documents across her desk. "Your brother made some critical mistakes. First, he failed to report the stolen benefits as income on his tax returns for 3 consecutive years. That's felony tax evasion. Second, when he applied for benefits in your name, he used his own address for correspondence, creating a clear paper trail. Third, he made large cash deposits into his personal accounts immediately after benefit payments were issued to you." Gianna leaned forward, studying the bank records Torres had obtained through federal subpoenas. Seeing the pattern laid out by a professional investigator made the scope of Marcus's crimes even more shocking. "The total amount we can prove he stole is actually higher than your original estimate," Torres continued. "Our investigation has uncovered additional fraudulent claims and redirected payments that you weren't aware of. The current total is just over $112,000. The number hit Gianna like a punch to the stomach. While she had been recovering from her combat injuries, struggling with medical appointments and disability evaluations, Marcus had been systematically looting her accounts on an even larger scale than she had realized. "What happens now?" Gianna asked. "We're preparing a case for federal prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's Office has already reviewed the evidence and agrees that we have strong grounds for multiple felony charges: wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and theft of government benefits. Each count carries significant prison time." Torres paused and looked directly at Gianna. "But I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. Your brother will likely hire an expensive defense attorney who will try to destroy your credibility. They'll claim you authorized his actions, that you're mentally unstable due to your combat injuries, that you're making false accusations out of spite or confusion. The warning didn't surprise Gianna. She had been preparing for this battle for months, documenting every interaction with Marcus and building a comprehensive record of events. There's something else, Torres added. When we execute search warrants and make arrests, this case will likely get media attention. The combination of military benefits fraud and family betrayal makes it newsworthy. Are you prepared for that level of public scrutiny? Gianna thought about the question carefully. For months, she had been fighting this battle in isolation, with only a few advocates and investigators on her side. The idea of her story becoming public was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Maybe other veterans in similar situations would come forward. Maybe the military would be forced to take these cases more seriously. Yes, she said finally. I'm ready for whatever comes. Torres nodded approvingly. Good, because we're also investigating whether this is part of a larger pattern. Your brother's consulting business had access to financial information for several other military families. We're reviewing those accounts for similar fraud. This revelation was completely unexpected. Gianna had assumed Marcus's crimes were limited to stealing from her, but the possibility that he had victimized other military families made the case exponentially more serious. How many other families? She asked. We're not sure yet. At least 3, possibly more. Your brother positioned himself as someone who specialized in helping military families manage their finances during deployments. It was the perfect cover for systematic fraud. The scope of Marcus's operation was staggering. While Gianna had been seeing herself as an isolated victim of family betrayal, Marcus had apparently been running a criminal enterprise that targeted military families specifically. Torres gathered the documents from her desk and placed them back in their respective files. The grand jury will hear this case within the next 60 days. If they return indictments, and I expect they will, arrests will follow immediately. I wanted to give you advance notice so you can prepare. As Gianna drove back to Colorado Springs, she felt a mixture of vindication and dread. The IRS investigation had validated everything she had claimed and uncovered crimes even worse than she had imagined. But she also knew that the hardest part was still ahead of her. That evening, she sat across from Marcus at dinner, watching him laugh at something Emma had said, seeing him put his arm around Sarah's shoulders, observing him play the role of devoted family man with practiced ease. In less than 2 months, federal agents would knock on his door with arrest warrants, and this carefully constructed facade would crumble. But Gianna felt no satisfaction in the thought. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice for herself and for the other military families Marcus had betrayed. It was about sending a message that veteran sacrifices couldn't be exploited without consequences. As she excused herself from dinner and went to her room, Gianna realized she had become someone she barely recognized. The trusting, idealistic young soldier who enlisted 8 years ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more cynical, but also more determined. The system had failed her family had betrayed her, but she had refused to accept defeat. Now, federal law enforcement was preparing to deliver the justice that the military had denied her. The countdown to Marcus's arrest had begun. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. Gianna was at her apartment. She had finally saved enough to move out 3 weeks earlier, when her phone rang. It was Special Agent Torres.
It's done, Torres said simply. We executed search warrants at your brother's home and business simultaneously. He's in federal custody, along with 2 associates who were helping him process fraudulent claims. Gianna sat down heavily on her couch, feeling a strange emptiness rather than the satisfaction she had expected. After 11 months of fighting, the moment felt almost anticlimactic. What about Sarah and Emma? She asked, thinking of her niece. Your sister-in-law wasn't arrested, but we did find evidence that she knew about at least some of the fraudulent activity. The grand jury will decide whether to indict her separately. Your niece is with Sarah's parents for now. The local news picked up the story that evening. Gianna described herself as a decorated Afghanistan veteran who discovered her brother had been systematically stealing her military benefits while she recovered from combat injuries. The reporter standing outside Marcus's house described it as one of the largest military benefits fraud cases in Colorado state history. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Gianna's phone started ringing constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, veterans organizations offering support, and other military families sharing similar stories of financial abuse by relatives. The most difficult call came from her parents. Her father, always Marcus's biggest defender, was furious. "How could you do this to your own family?" he demanded. "Marcus made some mistakes, but having him arrested? Destroying Emma's life? This is vindictive, Gianna." The conversation devolved into a screaming match that ended with her father hanging up on her. Her mother called an hour later, crying and begging Gianna to find a way to fix this before it went any further. The family pressure was overwhelming, but Gianna had learned to recognize manipulation tactics. Her parents were more concerned about the family's reputation than about the crimes Marcus had committed. They wanted her to prioritize family loyalty over justice, just as the military had wanted her to handle it as a personal matter rather than pursue accountability. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Marcus's attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer named Gregory Walsh, tried to negotiate a plea deal within the first week. Walsh's strategy was exactly what Agent Torres had predicted: portray Gianna as a confused veteran whose combat injuries had affected her memory and judgment. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountants had traced every fraudulent transaction, documented every forged signature, and established a clear timeline showing that Marcus's crimes had begun before Gianna's head injury and continued long after she had recovered. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered Marcus's personal laptop, which contained detailed spreadsheets tracking his fraudulent activities across multiple military families. He had been meticulously organized, treating the thefts like a business operation, with projected revenues and target victims. Walsh tried to claim the spreadsheets were fictional, part of some creative writing project or business plan, rather than documentation of actual crimes. But the correlation between the spreadsheet entries and real financial transactions was perfect down to the penny. 3 months after his arrest, Marcus accepted a plea agreement. He would plead guilty to 14 felony counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and theft of government benefits. In exchange for his cooperation in identifying other victims and recovering stolen assets, he would receive a sentence of 8 to 12 years in federal prison. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a cold December morning in the Denver federal courthouse. Gianna had prepared a victim impact statement, something she had been working on for weeks. She wanted to make sure the judge understood not just the financial impact of Marcus's crimes, but the psychological damage of being betrayed by family, while the system she had served refused to help her. Marcus looked different in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, stripped of the charm and confidence that had defined him throughout their lives. When he glanced back at her during the proceedings, she saw fear in his eyes rather than the manipulative warmth she remembered. Sarah was in the courtroom, sitting with Emma and her parents. She had not spoken to Gianna since the arrests, and the hatred in her eyes was unmistakable. Emma, now 9 years old, kept asking whispered questions that Sarah couldn't answer. When Judge Patricia Reynolds called for victim impact statement, Gianna walked to the podium with her prepared remarks. But standing there, looking at Marcus, and thinking about everything that had happened, she set her written statement aside. "Your Honor," she began, "my brother didn't just steal money from me. He stole my faith in family, my trust in the institutions I served, and my belief that sacrifice and service means something in this country." She looked directly at Marcus as she continued. "While I was in Afghanistan getting my brain scrambled by mortar attacks, while I was lying in a military hospital trying to remember my own name, while I was fighting to get the disability benefits I earned through my injuries, my brother was treating my service like a business opportunity." The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Emma quietly crying. But the worst part wasn't the theft. The worst part was discovering that the military I served for 8 years considered this a family matter rather than a crime against the federal government.
The worst part was being told that my service didn't make me a hero, that I wasn't special, that I deserved what happened to me because I was naive enough to trust my family. Gianna paused and took a breath. Your Honor, I'm not here asking for revenge. I'm here asking for justice, not just for me, but for every military family that trusted someone who saw their service and sacrifice as an opportunity for profit.
Judge Reynolds listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When Gianna finished and returned to her seat, the judge called for a brief recess before pronouncing the sentence. Marcus received 11 years in federal prison, the high end of his plea agreement range. He was also ordered to pay full restitution of $112,847 plus interest and penalties, and to forfeit his house and business assets. As the bailiff led Marcus away in shackles, he looked back at Gianna one final time. She thought he might mouth an apology or show some sign of remorse, but his expression was blank. Even in defeat, even facing 11 years in prison, Marcus seemed incapable of acknowledging the pain he had caused. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Gianna, asking for her reaction to the sentence. She gave a brief statement thanking Agent Torres and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, then mentioned that she hoped the case would encourage other veterans to report similar crimes and pressure the military to take these cases more seriously. As she drove home to Colorado Springs that evening, Gianna realized that the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it hadn't restored her faith in institutions or healed the family relationships that Marcus had destroyed. She had won, but the cost had been enormous. The next morning, she received a call from Janet Morrison, the veterans advocate who had helped her navigate the early stages of her case. "I've been getting calls from military families all week," Janet said. "Your case has opened the floodgates. Veterans from all over the country are coming forward with similar stories. The military is being forced to reconsider how they handle these cases." For the first time since the sentencing, Gianna felt a spark of genuine satisfaction. If her ordeal prevented other military families from experiencing the same betrayal and institutional abandonment, then perhaps the fight had been worth it. But she also knew that her story was far from over. The money was gone, the family relationships were destroyed, and she would be dealing with the psychological aftermath for years to come. The war for justice was won, but the battle to rebuild her life was just beginning. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, Gianna was testifying before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C. The hearing room was packed with reporters, veterans advocates, and military officials, all there to discuss proposed legislation that would reform how the Department of Defense handles financial crimes against service members. Representative Amanda Chen, the subcommittee chair, had reached out to Gianna personally after reading about her case in the Washington Post. Chen, herself a Navy veteran, was spearheading the Military Family Financial Protection Act, which would require mandatory investigations of all reported benefits fraud and establish victim assistance programs. "Miss Robinson's," Representative Chen began, "your case has become emblematic of a systemic failure to protect our service members from financial exploitation. Can you walk us through what happened when you first reported this crime to military authorities?" Gianna adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. Among the faces, she spotted Chief Warrant Officer Patterson, the Inspector General official who had dismissed her case initially. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as media cameras focused on the hearing. "Congresswoman Chen," Gianna began, "when I reported documented evidence of over $100,000 in fraud to the Inspector General's office, I was told that my military service didn't make me a hero, that this was a family dispute, and that I should handle it through civilian courts." A murmur rippled through the hearing room. Representative Chen leaned forward with obvious interest. "The investigating officer suggested that I was playing the victim and that my combat injuries might be affecting my judgment. Rather than investigating clear evidence of federal crimes, the military chose to protect its institutional reputation by dismissing the case as a personal matter." Patterson's face flushed red as cameras turned toward him. In the months since Marcus's conviction, his handling of Gianna's case had become a source of embarrassment for the Inspector General's office.
The hearing lasted 4 hours, with testimony from other veterans who had experienced similar institutional betrayals, military officials defending current policies, and experts explaining the scope of financial exploitation targeting military families. The most powerful moment came when Dr. Sarah Kim, a researcher from the Rand Corporation, presented data showing that financial abuse of military personnel by family members occurred at rates 300% higher than in civilian populations, but was investigated by military authorities at rates 80% lower than similar civilian cases. After the hearing, Gianna was approached by dozens of veterans sharing their own stories. Maria Santos, a former Marine, described how her ex-husband had stolen her combat pay while she was deployed to Iraq. David Martinez, an Army sergeant, explained how his mother had fraudulently claimed his death benefits while he was alive and serving overseas. Each story followed a similar pattern: trust betrayed, evidence ignored, institutional abandonment, and years of fighting for justice through civilian courts with minimal resources.
3 weeks after the congressional hearing, Gianna received an unexpected phone call from Colonel Jennifer Walsh, the new head of the Inspector General's office at Fort Carson. Walsh requested a meeting to discuss procedural improvements in response to Gianna's testimony. The meeting took place in the same conference room where Patterson had dismissed her case 2 years earlier. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Walsh was accompanied by 2 other officers, a court reporter, and a victim's advocate. "Miss Robinsons," Colonel Walsh began, "I want to start by offering you a formal apology on behalf of the Inspector General's office. The handling of your case fell far short of our standards and obligations to service members." The apology felt surreal. For so long, Gianna had been fighting not just Marcus, but the entire system that had failed her. Hearing an official acknowledgement of that failure was both validating and emotionally overwhelming. Walsh continued, "We've implemented new protocols based on your case. All reports of financial fraud involving military benefits will now trigger automatic investigations. We're also establishing partnerships with federal law enforcement to ensure these cases receive appropriate resources." The changes were significant, but Gianna wondered how many other veterans had been failed by the old system, how many had given up when faced with institutional indifference. As winter turned to spring, Gianna found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for military families facing financial exploitation. She spoke at veterans conferences, consulted with legal aid organizations, and helped other victims navigate the complex process of reporting and prosecuting financial crimes. The work was emotionally draining, but deeply meaningful. Each case she helped resolve felt like another step toward preventing what had happened to her from happening to others. In April, she received news that Marcus was being transferred to a minimum security federal prison in Texas. Sarah had divorced him while he was incarcerated and moved to Oregon with Emma, cutting off all contact with Gianna's side of the family. Their parents had moved to Arizona, still maintaining that Gianna had destroyed the family by pursuing criminal charges. The isolation from her family remained painful, but Gianna had built a new community among veterans advocates, other survivors of financial abuse, and the legal professionals who specialized in these cases. One afternoon, while reviewing case files for 3 new clients, Gianna's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Gianna, it's Emma." Her niece, now 11 years old, had somehow gotten her phone number. Sarah apparently didn't know about the call. "I wanted to tell you something," Emma said, her voice small and uncertain. "I know what Dad did was wrong. Mom says I shouldn't talk to you, but I remember when you lived with us, and you were always nice to me." The conversation lasted only a few minutes before Emma had to hang up, but it left Gianna feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Maybe the family relationships destroyed by Marcus's crimes weren't completely irreparable. 2 months later, the Military Family Financial Protection Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law by the president. The bill established mandatory investigation protocols, victim assistance programs, and federal funding for legal aid services targeting military families facing financial exploitation. At the bill signing ceremony, Gianna stood behind the president as he spoke about protecting those who protect America.
When he finished his remarks and handed her one of the signing pens, she thought about the young, idealistic soldier who had enlisted 9 years earlier, believing that service and sacrifice would be honored and protected. That person had been naive, but she hadn't been wrong about the importance of fighting for what was right. It had just taken longer and cost more than she had ever imagined. Later that evening, at a reception for veterans advocates, Gianna was approached by a young Army specialist who had recently returned from deployment in Syria. "Ma'am," the specialist said, "I wanted to thank you. My uncle was trying to get access to my accounts while I was overseas, claiming he needed to help with my bills. After seeing your story on the news, I knew something wasn't right. I reported it to the IG's office, and they investigated immediately. It turned out he'd already stolen money from 2 other soldiers in our unit." Stories like this have become common. Gianna's case had created awareness that was preventing other military families from experiencing the same betrayal and institutional abandonment she had endured. As she drove home that night through the streets of Denver, Gianna reflected on how completely her life had changed. The trusting young soldier was gone, replaced by someone harder but also more purposeful. She had lost a family but gained a mission.
The financial restitution from Marcus had finally started coming through, small monthly payments that would continue for years until the full amount was repaid. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that her fight had made the system better for other veterans, that her refusal to accept injustice had created lasting change. Tomorrow, she had meetings scheduled with 3 new clients, all military families facing financial exploitation by people they trusted. The work continued, one case at a time, one victory at a time, until no veteran would have to fight these battles alone. 2 years after the Military Family Financial Protection Act became law, Gianna stood at the grave of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres in Arlington National Cemetery. She had never met Michael, but his widow, Lisa, had reached out to her 6 months earlier with a story that felt hauntingly familiar. Michael had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan in 2019. While Lisa grieved and tried to navigate the complex process of survivor benefits, Michael's brother had systematically stolen over $60,000 from her accounts, claiming he was helping manage her finances during her time of grief. When Lisa reported the theft to military authorities, she was told it was a family matter and advised to pursue civil remedies. That was before the new legislation. Under the reformed system, Lisa's case was investigated within 2 weeks, her brother-in-law was arrested within 6 months, and she received full restitution plus damages. More importantly, she never faced the institutional abandonment and gaslighting that had defined Gianna's experience. "I don't know how you survived what you went through," Lisa said as they placed flowers on Michael's grave. "Fighting your own family and the system at the same time, with no support, while dealing with combat injuries. I can't imagine the strength that it took." Gianna looked out over the endless rows of white headstones stretching across the Virginia hillside. Each one represented someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice, and she wondered how many of their families had been exploited in their grief, how many had fought battles for justice that no one would ever know about. "I almost didn't survive it," Gianna admitted. "There were nights when I thought about giving up, letting Marcus keep the money, accepting that justice wasn't meant for people like me. But then I'd think about all the other military families going through the same thing, and I couldn't quit." The drive back to Colorado gave Gianna time to reflect on how much had changed since that first meeting with Chief Warrant Officer Patterson. Her advocacy organization, Military Family Justice, now employed 12 people and handled over 300 cases annually. The organization had recovered more than $4 million in stolen benefits and secured convictions in dozens of federal fraud cases. But the personal cost remained significant. Her parents had never reconciled with her decision to pursue criminal charges against Marcus. They attended family gatherings that she wasn't invited to, maintained relationships with relatives who viewed her as a family destroyer, and continued to send money to Marcus's commissary account in federal prison. Emma, now 13, had started texting Gianna regularly, despite Sarah's disapproval. The messages were brief but meaningful, updates about school, questions about Gianna's military service, and occasional expressions of love that reminded Gianna why the fight had been worthwhile.
The most unexpected development came in the form of a letter Gianna received on a Tuesday morning in October. The return address showed Colorado State Penitentiary, where Marcus had been transferred for the final 2 years of his sentence. Inside was a handwritten letter, 4 pages long, in Marcus's familiar script. Gianna, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. I've spent 3 years in federal prison thinking about what I did to you, to our family, and to all the other military families I stole from. I want you to know that I understand now what I put you through. Not just the financial theft, but the betrayal while you were serving overseas, while you were injured, while you trusted me to protect your interests. There's no excuse for what I did. I've been following news about your advocacy work from prison. Other inmates show me articles about the legislation that passed, about military family justice, about the families you've helped. I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built from the wreckage I created. I'm being released in 18 months. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect a relationship. I just wanted you to know that I understand the gravity of what I did, and that watching you turn your pain into purpose has been the most humbling experience of my life. Your brother, Marcus. Gianna read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. The words seemed genuine, but she had learned not to trust Marcus's expressions of sincerity. Still, something about the tone felt different from his previous manipulations, humbler, more broken. That evening, she called Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the therapist she had been seeing for 2 years to work through the trauma of family betrayal and institutional abandonment. "What do you think about the letter?" Dr. Chen asked during their session. "I think he's learned to write what people want to hear," replied. "Prison probably has programs about taking responsibility and making amends. I don't trust it." "But you kept the letter."
I kept the letter. What does that tell you? Gianna considered the question. Maybe that I'm not as closed off to the possibility of healing as I thought I was. Or maybe I'm still naive enough to hope that people can actually change. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The conversation stayed with Gianna for weeks. She found herself thinking about forgiveness, not as absolution for Marcus's crimes, but as a way of releasing herself from the anger that had fueled her advocacy work for 4 years. In December, Gianna received news that would reshape her understanding of her own story. Agent Torres called to inform her that Marcus's case had led to the largest military benefits fraud prosecution in federal history. The investigation had uncovered a network of criminals specifically targeting military families, with Marcus serving as a key figure in documenting their methods. "We've recovered over $12 million in stolen benefits," Torres explained. "Your brother's detailed record-keeping became the roadmap for prosecuting the entire network. 47 people have been charged, including financial advisors, accountants, and family members who systematically exploited military personnel." The scope was staggering. What Gianna had experienced as an isolated family betrayal was actually part of a much larger criminal conspiracy that had victimized hundreds of military families across multiple states. "There's something else," Torres continued. "The Department of Justice wants to recognize your contribution to this investigation. Your refusal to accept the military's initial dismissal, your systematic documentation of the fraud, and your advocacy work created the foundation for everything that followed." A month later, Gianna stood in the Great Hall of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., receiving the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service. The citation read, "For exceptional courage in pursuing justice despite institutional failure, and for transforming personal tragedy into systemic reform that has protected countless military families from financial exploitation." As Attorney General Patricia Williams placed the medal around her neck, Gianna thought about the young soldier who had trusted her brother with her financial affairs 8 years earlier. That person could never have imagined this moment, this recognition, this transformation of pain into purpose. After the ceremony, Gianna was approached by a young Marine corporal who was attending law school on the GI Bill. "Ma'am," the Marine said, "I wanted to thank you. My grandmother was trying to get power of attorney over my accounts while I was deployed, claiming she needed to help pay for my college expenses. I almost signed the papers, but then I remembered your story from the news. Instead, I reported it to the new IG protocols.
Turned out she'd been planning to take out loans against my benefits. Stories like this had become Gianna's new normal. The systematic changes she had fought for were preventing crimes before they occurred, protecting military families who would never know how close they had come to being victimized. As she flew back to Denver that evening, Gianna realized that her story had reached its true conclusion. Not with Marcus's conviction, not with the passage of legislation, but with the knowledge that her refusal to accept injustice had created lasting protection for the military community she had served. The plane descended through the clouds above Colorado, and Gianna could see the lights of Denver spreading out below her. Somewhere in that sprawling city were military families who would never experience the betrayal she had endured, who would never have to face institutional abandonment when they needed help most, who would never have to choose between family loyalty and justice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Saw you on the news tonight. I'm proud to be your niece." But even as the recognition and accolades accumulated, Gianna knew her mission was far from complete. 3 days after returning from Washington, she received a call that reminded her why the work needed to continue. Sergeant First Class Robert Kim was calling from Fort Bragg, his voice shaking with rage and desperation. His wife's sister had been systematically stealing from their joint accounts while Robert was deployed to Syria, taking advantage of his wife's postpartum depression following the birth of their second child. The theft totaled $43,000, including money they had saved for their daughter's medical treatments. She had been born with a rare genetic condition requiring expensive therapies. "Miss Robinsons, I know the new laws are supposed to protect us, but the investigation is moving so slowly. My daughter needs her treatments now, and we can't afford them without that money. The doctors say delaying treatment could affect her development permanently." Gianna immediately connected Robert with expedited victim services and a legal aid attorney who specialized in emergency asset recovery. Within 72 hours, a federal judge had frozen the sister-in-law's accounts and ordered immediate return of the stolen funds. The treatments continued without interruption, but the case highlighted gaps that still existed in the system.
This became the catalyst for Gianna's next major initiative, the Military Family Emergency Recovery Protocol, designed to handle cases where stolen benefits were needed for urgent medical care, housing payments, or other time-sensitive expenses. Working with federal prosecutors and veterans organizations, she developed procedures for expedited investigations and emergency asset freezing that could be implemented within days rather than months. The protocol was tested 6 months later when Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez contacted Military Family Justice from Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Maria's ex-husband had stolen her housing allowance and family separation pay while she was stationed overseas, leaving her unable to pay for her elderly mother's nursing home in Texas. The mother was being threatened with eviction from the facility, and Maria was facing a choice between abandoning her military duties to handle the crisis personally or watching her mother become homeless. Using the new emergency protocols, Gianna's team worked with federal investigators to freeze the ex-husband's accounts within 48 hours and recover the stolen funds within a week. Maria's mother remained in care, and Maria completed her overseas assignment without compromising her military responsibilities. Each successful case brought new challenges and revealed additional vulnerabilities that criminals were exploiting. Gianna found herself constantly adapting, developing new protection strategies, and working with lawmakers to close loopholes as they were discovered. The emotional toll of handling hundreds of betrayal cases began affecting Gianna in ways she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Chen noticed increased anxiety and hypervigilance during their sessions, symptoms that reminded both of them of Gianna's combat-related PTSD. "You're experiencing secondary trauma," Dr. Chen explained during one particularly difficult session. "You're absorbing the pain and betrayal from every case you handle. Your brain is processing these stories as if they're happening to you personally." The insight led Gianna to establish peer support programs within Military Family Justice, connecting survivors of financial exploitation with trained counselors and other veterans who had experienced similar betrayals. She also began taking regular breaks from casework, spending time in the Colorado mountains hiking and camping, activities that reminded her of the peace she had found during recovery from her combat injuries. One of these mountain retreats led to an unexpected encounter that would reshape her understanding of her own journey. While camping near Aspen, she met Dr. William Harrison, a retired Army psychiatrist who had specialized in treating financial trauma among military personnel. Dr. Harrison had been following Gianna's advocacy work and was impressed by her systematic approach to institutional change. Over a campfire dinner, he shared research showing that financial betrayal by family members created psychological damage comparable to combat trauma, with similar patterns of hypervigilance, trust issues, and chronic stress responses. What you've accomplished, Dr. Harrison told her, isn't just about recovering money or changing policies. You've created a model for how individuals can challenge systemic failures and create lasting institutional change. That's extremely rare. Their conversation continued throughout the weekend, with Dr. Harrison explaining how Gianna's case had become a teaching example in military psychology programs. Her refusal to accept institutional dismissal, her systematic documentation of evidence, and her transformation of personal trauma into advocacy work was being studied as a framework for other veterans facing similar challenges. This perspective helped Gianna understand why she had become such a lightning rod for both praise and criticism. Some military officials resented her public challenges to institutional authority, while others saw her as a necessary catalyst for reform. Some family members of fraud perpetrators viewed her as vindictive and unforgiving, while victims saw her as a beacon of hope and validation. The complexity of these reactions became clear during a veterans conference in Phoenix, where Gianna was giving a keynote speech about financial exploitation prevention. During the question and answer session, a middle-aged woman approached the microphone with obvious hostility. "Miss Robinsons," the woman said, her voice trembling with anger, "my son made some mistakes with his sister's military benefits while she was deployed. Instead of handling it as a family matter, she had him arrested and sent to federal prison. Now my grandchildren don't have a father and our family is destroyed. Don't you think there's something to be said for forgiveness and keeping families together?" The question hit Gianna like a physical blow. For a moment, she was back in Marcus's living room, being pressured by family members to prioritize loyalty over justice. But then she looked out at the audience and saw dozens of veterans who had experienced financial betrayal, people who were finally finding validation for their experiences. "Ma'am," Gianna replied carefully, "I understand that criminal prosecution of family members is devastating for everyone involved, but what you're describing as mistakes are federal crimes that destroyed your daughter's financial security while she was serving our country overseas. Choosing to protect criminals, even when they're family members, sends a message to other potential perpetrators that military families are acceptable targets." The exchange was captured on video and went viral within days, sparking national debates about family loyalty, military service, and the appropriate response to financial crimes. Gianna received thousands of messages, ranging from support from other veterans to death threats from people who viewed her as a family destroyer. The controversy led to an invitation to appear on a national morning show where she would debate the ethics of prosecuting family members for financial crimes against military personnel. Her opponent was Dr. Patricia Moore, a family therapist who argued that criminal prosecution should be a last resort and that families should prioritize reconciliation over punishment. The television appearance became a defining moment in Gianna's advocacy career. When Dr. Moore argued that family bonds were more important than money, Gianna responded with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Dr. Moore, with respect, this isn't about money. It's about trust, service, and the social contract between military personnel and society. When someone volunteers to serve their country, they're trusting their community to protect their interests while they're away. When family members betray that trust, they're not just stealing money, they're attacking the foundation that allows military service to exist." The appearance generated significant media coverage and led to speaking invitations from universities, military academies, and professional conferences. Gianna found herself becoming not just an advocate for fraud victims, but a voice for broader conversations about ethics, accountability, and the true cost of military service. As her profile grew, so did the scope of military family justice. The organization expanded beyond fraud cases to address predatory lending targeting military personnel, housing discrimination against veterans, and education benefit scams that specifically targeted service members using their GI Bill benefits. Each new area of focus revealed additional layers of exploitation that Gianna hadn't initially recognized. Military families weren't just vulnerable to theft by relatives, they were being systematically targeted by criminals across multiple industries who viewed their benefits and deployments as opportunities for profit. The breadth of the problem was staggering, but it also reinforced Gianna's belief that her initial case with Marcus had been part of something much larger than personal betrayal. She had uncovered the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into American society than anyone had realized. Now, standing in her office overlooking downtown Denver, surrounded by case files representing hundreds of military families who had found justice through her work, Gianna reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The idealistic young soldier who had enlisted 9 years earlier was gone, replaced by someone harder but infinitely more capable of creating change. For the first time in years, Gianna felt something that had been missing since her first deployment to Afghanistan. She felt like she was home. The war was over. She had won. But more importantly, she had ensured that future battles would be fought on more favorable ground, with better weapons and with institutional support rather than institutional abandonment. That, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.